She said he was nothing, but somehow I felt like nothing too. It's emotional, mysterious, and immediately sets up tension while hinting at the slow-burn romance. He first noticed her on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that usually slipped by unnoticed. But the moment she walked into the room, everything else seemed to blur at the edges. She moved with a quiet confidence that didn't need to be loud or demanding. It was in the ease of her posture, the measured way she crossed her arms, and the subtle tilt of her head, as if she were listening to an invisible rhythm only she could hear. She was beautiful, not in a way that screamed for attention, but in the graceful, lived-in way of someone who had learned how to carry herself through life's complexities. Her age, somewhere in the early 40s, didn't diminish her charm. If anything, it added depth, a sense of experience wrapped in softness, like sunlight filtered through a warm autumn afternoon. She was speaking to someone about a man she had clearly dismissed. "He's nothing," she said, the words sharp but tinged with something almost fragile, as if they were meant to protect her. That phrase stuck in his mind, repeated silently like a puzzle he couldn't solve. The contradiction of her strength and hidden vulnerability drew him in instantly, making him observe her more closely, though he struggled to find a way to approach without crossing an invisible line. From where he stood, he noticed the little things, the way her hair fell in loose waves, catching the light when she shifted slightly, the way her fingers toyed with the edge of her sleeve when she laughed softly, the way her eyes scanned the room, careful yet thoughtful, as if she were quietly measuring every detail. These small, seemingly insignificant gestures told him more about her than any words could. He felt a flutter of curiosity mixed with hesitation. He wanted to know her, but he also feared the walls she had carefully built around herself. There was a warmth in her presence that seemed to settle around him, even without intention. When she moved closer to the table, he noticed the faint scent of her perfume, subtle, floral, almost comforting, and it lingered in the air long after she moved away, leaving him aware of her absence in a way that was strange and new. His chest tightened for reasons he didn't fully understand. Admiration, certainly, but also a subtle ache, a yearning for connection he wasn't sure he was ready to admit. He wrestled with the contradiction of wanting to reach out while respecting her space, caught between desire and caution. The way she said the words "he's nothing" felt like a protective shield, yet he could see the cracks, small, almost imperceptible, but they were enough to make him hope. He wondered who this man was and why she had drawn such a hard line. But more than that, he wondered what it would take for him to see the person she truly was beneath the confident, sometimes guarded exterior. For a moment, their eyes met across the room, hers flicking with a spark of curiosity, his holding steady in quiet observation. It was a fleeting connection, almost nothing to anyone else, but to him, it felt like the first brush of possibility, a tentative opening that promised more than words could ever capture. In that instant, he knew something was about to change, though neither of them realized how slowly or how deeply that change would reach into their lives. After that first fleeting encounter, he found himself noticing her everywhere, her presence quietly threading through the background of his days. There was something magnetic about the way she moved through life, confident yet deliberately distant, always careful to maintain control over the space around her. He wanted to speak to her, to bridge the invisible gap that seemed to separate them, but each attempt was met with subtle resistance. She would smile politely, tilt her head, or respond with a gentle, almost teasing remark, but never enough to truly welcome him in. She tested him in small, unspoken ways. Sometimes it was a glance that lingered slightly too long, a tone of voice that carried a question he couldn't quite answer, or a soft laugh that seemed directed at him and no one else. He sensed she was aware of his attention, aware of the quiet admiration that had begun to grow, and yet she didn't encourage it. There was a wall there, a protective barrier formed by experience, perhaps disappointment, or a lingering caution from past encounters. But behind that wall, glimpses of warmth shone through like light through frosted glass. Their interactions became a delicate dance. He tried to make conversation, asking simple questions or commenting on minor details, and she would respond in a measured way, her words polite but distant. Yet sometimes she allowed a softness, a fleeting vulnerability to slip into her expression, a micro-smile, a half-laugh, or a pause that lingered just a beat too long. Each small signal made him question his own interpretations. Was she cold, or just careful? Was she guarding herself from him, or testing him to see if he could be patient enough to understand her? The tension built in the smallest gestures. One day, their hands brushed as they reached for the same folder. The accidental contact left him acutely aware of her warmth, the subtle pressure of her skin against his. She didn't recoil, but neither did she acknowledge it. The moment passed, almost invisible to anyone else, yet it lingered in his mind, sparking a quiet, unspoken awareness that there was more between them than words could capture. He began to notice patterns in her behavior, how she softened slightly when no one was watching, how she seemed to hold her breath when he was nearby, or how she occasionally allowed her gaze to settle on him a second longer than necessary. Each observation drew him deeper, not in a lust, but into curiosity and genuine care. He wanted to understand her, to be the person who saw past the polished exterior and recognized the quiet fragility beneath it. And yet, the coldness remained, sometimes biting and sharp, a reminder that she was not easily won. He learned to navigate the gaps, pausing when she pulled away, listening when she spoke, and observing when she retreated. Every interaction became a puzzle of nuance, a delicate game of presence and restraint, where even the smallest gesture, a smile, a glance, a brush of hands, carried weight beyond its simplicity. By the end of this period, the tension was palpable but unresolved. He wanted to reach her, yet he respected the boundaries she silently enforced. The magnetic pull between them had grown stronger, simmering quietly, promising that when the walls finally lowered, the connection would be profound, charged with emotion that had been building in the pauses, glances, and unspoken moments all along. Time had a strange way of moving when he was around her. The moments that once felt ordinary began to stretch, infused with a subtle tension he could neither ignore nor fully understand. Circumstances began to place them in proximity more often, whether it was a shared project, a chance encounter during errands, or being tasked with helping her with something that required patience and attention. Each situation, though mundane to the outside world, became charged with unspoken possibilities. During one such encounter, she let her guard slip in a way that was almost imperceptible but deeply revealing. A frustrated sigh escaped her lips as she struggled with a problem, her shoulders tense and her fingers pressing tightly against the edge of a table. He approached quietly, offering help, not out of bravado, but out of genuine concern. For a moment, she simply looked at him, her eyes measuring, almost surprised that he hadn't overstepped or assumed anything. Then, ever so subtly, she allowed him closer, guiding his hands where she needed support. Their fingers brushed, lingering longer than necessary, and he felt a warmth radiate from her touch, an almost fragile trust forming in the quiet of that shared space. In these shared moments, he began to notice more than just her physical presence. He observed the gentle rise and fall of her chest when she laughed softly at a small joke, the way her gaze would soften when she thought no one was watching, and the almost imperceptible tremor in her voice when she admitted, ever so quietly, that she felt alone sometimes. These were the cracks in her armor, the glimpses of vulnerability that few ever saw. And in those glimpses, he saw a side of her that was profoundly human, flawed, and yet mesmerizing in its honesty. There was a slow, almost imperceptible shift in their dynamic. The teasing and polite distance remained, but interspersed with it were fleeting moments of connection. A shared glance that lasted a beat too long, the accidental brush of their shoulders as they moved through a room, and the quiet spaces where words weren't necessary, but presence itself spoke volumes. Each small interaction left him increasingly aware of her, not just as a woman to admire, but as a person whose emotions and thoughts he was beginning to understand on a deeper level. He felt an unexpected sense of anticipation in her company, a curious blend of nervousness and exhilaration. Every smile, every brief touch, seemed charged with an unspoken question. Could this cautious curiosity ever grow into something more meaningful? And he realized, with a mix of excitement and trepidation, that he wanted to find out. By the end of these shared moments, the tension had evolved. It was no longer merely the magnetic pull of her presence or the intrigue of her guarded nature. It was a quiet, mutual recognition of each other's existence in a world that often overlooked subtle connection. She had allowed him to see fragments of her truth, and he, in turn, began to understand the depth behind her careful distance. It was a fragile foundation, yes, but a foundation nonetheless, upon which something real could slowly, patiently grow. Just when the rhythm between them seemed to settle into a quiet, delicate familiarity, a subtle misunderstanding arose, one that neither expected but both felt keenly. It began with a conversation he had thought was casual, a small remark meant to be helpful, only to be met with a sharp glance from her. The warmth he had started to rely on was suddenly replaced by a subtle coolness, a distance that made the air between them feel heavier than before. He replayed the moment over and over in his mind, wondering if he had misread the signs, if he had intruded where he wasn't wanted. The tension gnawed at him quietly, a mix of disappointment and frustration that was almost painful because it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the silent type of hurt, the kind that comes from realizing that the person you care about may not see you as you see them. From her side, the reaction was equally layered. She had sensed something in his tone, a closeness that perhaps felt too familiar too soon, and instinctively retreated. It wasn't anger, not really, but a protective measure, a way to maintain control over her emotions and avoid vulnerability she wasn't ready to share. Her words remained polite, even neutral, but the subtle cues in her posture, the slight stiffening of her shoulders, the careful placement of her hands on the table, the way her gaze darted away instead of holding his, made it clear that the emotional distance he had been cautiously closing had been reinforced again. In the quiet aftermath, he noticed the small, almost invisible moments of longing he had previously taken for granted. The brush of her hand across his when passing a document, the way her laughter had once softened when he teased her, the micro-expressions that had hinted at a vulnerability he now realized he might never fully reach if he didn't navigate this carefully. Each memory stung with the awareness that he could so easily misstep, and that the fragile trust they had been building was as delicate as fine glass. Yet the friction wasn't entirely negative, it forced reflection. He began to understand that her behavior wasn't about rejecting him personally, but about protecting herself. And that insight created an almost painful empathy, a desire not just to be close, but to respect the wall she had built, even as he longed for them to lower. Likewise, she began to notice his restraint, the way he didn't push, the quiet patience that marked every interaction. Even in her coolness, there was something grounding about him, a steady presence that contrasted with the emotional turbulence she often felt inside. There were fleeting moments of accidental closeness amid the tension, a shared glance that lingered despite her attempt to look away, or a brief touch when passing a pen, that served as reminders of what could be should they navigate the misunderstandings. The silent pull between them grew more complicated, charged not just with attraction, but with emotion, hesitation, and the subtle vulnerability they were both learning to guard and respect. By the end of this stage, the tension had become almost palpable, but it was no longer simple uncertainty. It was a complex weave of desire, caution, and emerging understanding, a slow-burn fire that promised eventual intimacy, but only if they could face the friction honestly and navigate the emotions it brought to the surface. The tension between them had been simmering quietly for weeks, a delicate thread of curiosity, frustration, and unspoken longing stretching taut in the spaces they shared. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the wall she had carefully built began to show cracks. It was in the quiet confessions she allowed herself in fleeting moments, remarks meant to be casual, but which revealed something deeper. a soft sigh as she spoke about a lingering worry, a pause when she admitted, almost reluctantly, that she sometimes felt unseen or unappreciated. He noticed these moments with acute attention, not because he was searching for flaws, but because each gesture felt like an invitation to understand her in a way no one else had. The vulnerability was subtle, quiet. Her voice softened, her eyes darted away briefly, and there was a tension in her posture, a hesitation that betrayed the trust she was extending by simply speaking the truth. It was a fragile gift, one he wanted to honor, and he responded carefully, not with grand gestures, but with a quiet steadiness that spoke volumes, a nod, a patient silence, a hand resting lightly near hers without intruding. For the first time, he saw beyond the confident exterior she presented to the world. He recognized the layers of complexity, the strength forged from experience, the self-protective distance, and the moments of doubt she rarely revealed. And with that recognition came a startling clarity. He wanted to be someone she could lean on, someone whose presence felt like a safe harbor rather than a threat. He realized that admiration alone was no longer enough. He wanted connection, understanding, and a quiet intimacy that transcended words. She, in turn, began to notice the constancy in him. The way he listened, not just to her words, but to the silences between them. The way he respected the spaces she claimed, never pressing too hard, never rushing her. There was something grounding about him, a quiet assurance that contrasted with the chaos she sometimes felt inside. And slowly, reluctantly, she let herself lean just a little into that steadiness, finding comfort in the knowledge that someone truly saw her and wanted to see her, not as an image of perfection, but as a whole, complex person. Their interactions began to change subtly. A brush of hands lingered longer, a shared smile held just a beat too long, and moments of silence became charged with meaning rather than awkwardness. Emotional walls that had once felt immovable now seemed permeable, letting in the warmth of connection, the quiet thrill of shared understanding. Even when words were sparse, presence became communication. A look across the room, a hand lightly resting on a chair beside the other, the gentle, unspoken acknowledgement of shared experience. By the end of these moments, realization had fully taken root in both of them. She recognized that the assumptions she had clung to about who mattered, about who could be trusted, were no longer holding her back in the same way. And he recognized the depth of care and patience it required to truly reach her, a challenge he welcomed rather than feared. For the first time, the slow-burn tension between them felt like more than uncertainty. It felt like possibility, fragile yet undeniable, waiting to grow into a meaningful, lasting connection. After the fragile yet powerful realization of their vulnerabilities, the dynamic between them began to shift in ways that were subtle, natural, and profoundly moving. There was no grand declaration or sudden change, just a slow unfolding of moments that made the emotional distance between them shrink with quiet, undeniable force. What had once been cautious observation and hesitant connection now began to carry warmth, comfort, and an unmistakable tension of mutual affection. He started noticing the way she lingered in conversation, how her eyes held his gaze just a fraction longer, the gentle way her hand would brush against his when passing something across the table. These small, seemingly inconsequential gestures had taken on new weight. They were no longer accidental, but deliberate, a silent language they were beginning to share. Every fleeting touch, every brush of shoulder carried a quiet thrill that neither wanted to name too loudly, but both felt deeply. She, too, began to recognize the steadiness he offered, not just in his patience, but in the way he seemed to understand the rhythm of her moods, the subtleties of her silences, and the patterns in her humor. There was a growing comfort in his presence, a sense that she could let herself relax, even just slightly, without fear of judgment or intrusion. Her smiles became softer, laughter more frequent, and occasionally, there were moments when her guard dropped entirely, revealing glimpses of the warmth and tenderness she had hidden for so long. Their interactions became a delicate dance of closeness. They shared spaces with ease, the accidental brushing of hands turning into purposeful, yet subtle, touches. Sitting together, their shoulders would graze, a fleeting press of warmth that lingered in his mind long after. When she laughed at something he said, her hand might rest lightly on his arm, just long enough to communicate reassurance, connection, and an intimacy that words could not convey. There was also the quiet intimacy of presence. Even without conversation, being near her brought a comforting sense of belonging. In the shared silence of a coffee shop, a library, or a slow walk, their awareness of one another became a conversation in itself. Heartbeats, breaths, glances, and the soft weight of her hand on his back as she navigated a crowd. It was subtle, yet it carried a weight of meaning far beyond the ordinary. At the same time, there remained a careful balance. Neither rushed the process, and both were deeply aware of the fragility of what they were building. Every touch, every look, every shared smile was measured, intentional, and respectful. The slow-burn tension that had simmered for weeks now felt like a warm, steady flame, promising something more substantial and lasting if nurtured with patience and care. By the end of this stage, the emotional closeness between them was undeniable. They no longer merely occupied the same space, they shared it. Their connection had moved beyond curiosity and observation into genuine affection, trust, and mutual recognition. The longing, hesitation, and tension of the earlier chapters had transformed into a quiet, tender intimacy, the kind that makes ordinary moments feel charged, ordinary conversations feel profound, and ordinary touches feel like whispers of the heart. After weeks of tentative gestures, quiet glances, and carefully measured interactions, the distance between them finally began to dissolve. The walls she had built, strong, deliberate, protective, were no longer entirely necessary. Not with him. He had proven, through patience, attentiveness, and quiet consistency, that he was different from anyone she had dismissed or judged in the past. In his presence, she felt safe enough to let her guard down, to acknowledge the subtle pull she had long ignored. The moment of resolution came not with grand words, but with a quiet, intimate conversation, the kind that can only happen when both people are truly present and willing to be honest. She admitted, softly, almost reluctantly, that she had been wrong to underestimate him. "I thought he was nothing," she confessed, her voice betraying a mix of embarrassment and relief. "But you've shown me that I was wrong, that maybe I wasn't seeing what was right in front of me." Her eyes, warm yet vulnerable, held his, searching for the understanding she feared she might not receive. He didn't respond with triumph or self-satisfaction. Instead, he offered calm, sincere reassurance. "I never wanted to prove anything," he said gently. "I just wanted to be here, to see you, to understand you." It was the kind of honesty that required courage, the kind that deepened trust and built emotional intimacy. The tension that had lingered for so long, the hesitations, the unspoken questions, the fear of misjudgment, melted into a shared understanding that neither had to speak aloud. They belonged in each other's presence. Their physical closeness reflected the emotional warmth they had cultivated over time. A hand brushed lightly against another, fingers intertwined without urgency, lingering just long enough to convey trust and mutual comfort. A soft, tentative touch to the shoulder, a gentle squeeze of the hand, a cheek resting lightly against the shoulder. These gestures, small and unassuming, carried more weight than words ever could. Every movement was deliberate yet natural, a reflection of affection that had grown slowly, steadily, and irreversibly. Even ordinary moments, walking side by side, sharing coffee, sitting quietly on a park bench, were infused with the warmth of their connection. Every glance, every fleeting touch, every quiet laugh created an unspoken language unique to them, a rhythm of intimacy that spoke of patience, respect, and genuine care. There was no need to rush, no need to force anything, because the slow burn of their shared journey had already cemented a bond that felt enduring and real. By the end, there was closure not only in their emotional journey, but also in the story itself. The misunderstanding, the friction, and the hesitation had all served to deepen their connection rather than weaken it. She recognized the depth of his sincerity. He understood the complexity of her heart. Together, they reached a point of quiet contentment, the kind that comes from truly knowing and being known. As they stood together in that final moment, hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, there was a sense of completeness. The past doubts, the fleeting uncertainties, and the unspoken fears were no longer obstacles. They were the foundation of a relationship that had been built carefully, patiently, and with profound care. It was not just a romance that had blossomed. It was a connection grounded in respect, tenderness, and emotional truth. In each other's presence, they had found home, warmth, and a love that, though slow to grow, was destined to endure.